The garage smelled like it always did at 2 in the morning. Motor oil and cold metal and the particular kind of silence that only exists when the rest of the world has gone to sleep and left you alone with your work. Imani Cole had grown up with that smell. She had taken her first breath inside a garage, not much different from this one. Or at least that was what her father used to say, laughing while he wiped his hands on a red shop rag that was already too dirty to do any good. She did not laugh about it anymore. The fluorescent light above the third bay flickered the way it always did on cold nights, casting everything in a pale, unsteady glow that made the shadows jump. Imani was flat on her back beneath a 1987 Ford pickup truck, her left hand pressed against the undercarriage and her right hand working a socket wrench, with the slow, certain patience of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. Her fingers knew what to do without being told. That was the thing about real skill. It lived in the hands, not in the head. Outside, the wind moved through Rockfield, Texas, the way it always moved in February, low and flat, and carrying the smell of distant rain that would not come for another 3 days. The town had been quiet since 9 o'clock. The diner on Main Street had turned off its neon sign. The gas station on Route 12 had gone dark. Even the dogs had stopped barking. Imani worked alone. She had been running Morrison's garage for 11 years now, since she was 23 years old, and had driven back to Rockfield with nothing but a used toolbox, a mechanic's certification from the Technical College in Abilene, and a stubbornness that her aunt called a character flaw, and that Imani called the only inheritance worth keeping. The garage had not been easy to reclaim. There had been lawyers and judges and paperwork that seemed designed specifically to exhaust her. There had been years when she worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, doing oil changes during the day and waitressing at night, saving every dollar she could, filing every motion her legal aid attorney could scrape together. But the garage was hers now, legally, finally, completely hers. The sign above the door said Morrison's Garage in letters her father had painted himself. And even though the paint had faded and cracked in the Texas sun until some of the letters were barely readable, she had never once considered repainting it. She had touched up the letters herself, carefully matching the original color as closely as she could. She was not going to change the way her father had written his name. The socket wrench slipped. She caught it before it fell, her grip tightening on instinct, and she lay still for a moment in the dark beneath the truck, listening to her own breathing. Her back ached. Her shoulders ached. She had been under this truck for 4 hours, and she was not done yet. And she had an early appointment in the morning that she could not afford to cancel. She pushed herself back up anyway. The work did not care how tired she was. She was standing at the workbench writing up her notes on the Ford job when she heard it. A vehicle pulling into the lot. Heavy moving, slow, and then the sound of a trailer hitch engaging with something large. She set down her pen and walked to the bay door. The truck was an old Ram, dark blue, and it was pulling a flatbed with a motorcycle on it. A Harley Davidson. Even from where she stood, even in the dark, she could see that the bike was something. The chrome caught the moonlight, wrong too much of it, in the way of a machine that had been built with intention. The engine block was visible from 20 feet away, massive and dark, the kind of engine that does not apologize for the space it takes up. The man driving the truck climbed out without looking at her. He was big, the way men who have spent their lives doing physical work get big, not gym-built, but work-built. His arms thick and his shoulders rounded with the particular density of someone who has been loading and unloading and swinging and hauling since before Imani was born. He wore a Carhartt jacket, and had not shaved in what looked like 10 days. He hooked his thumbs in his belt and looked at the bike on the trailer. He had called ahead. Imani had taken the message herself. Engine seized. Could not be coaxed. 3 other shops had looked at it and said it was too far gone. She had said, "Bring it in." She signed for the bike and the man drove away without a word. And Imani walked around the Harley with a flashlight for a long time before she touched it. It was a 1965 FLH Electra Glide. Somebody had spent serious money on this machine at some point in its life. Real craftsman money, the kind of attention that meant a person had a relationship with a bike, the way other people have relationships with other people. The gas tank had 2 custom skulls worked into the paint. Deep burgundy on black, and the detailing was precise enough that even now, with the engine cold and the whole machine sitting dead on a trailer, it had presence. She went back inside and made a pot of coffee and started working. By 4 in the morning, she had the engine partially disassembled and had found the problem, or the beginning of the problem, the first of what she suspected were several. By 5:30, she had a cleaner picture of what the bike needed and had started the kind of careful, methodical work that could not be rushed. By 6:15, the sky outside had begun to go from black to gray, and Imani finally stopped, washed her hands, and sat down on the old wooden stool by the workbench with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. She drank it anyway. She thought about her father. Joseph Morrison had bought this garage in 1989 with money he had saved for 6 years, driving long-haul routes from El Paso to Memphis and back. He had wanted something that was his, something he could put his name on and build with his hands. He had not had a business degree or a mentor or a line of credit from a bank that wanted to help him. He had had the money he saved and the skills he had taught himself, and the stubbornness that Imani now recognized as the most important thing he had ever given her. He had been a good mechanic, not a flashy one, not the kind who talked about engines at dinner parties or used technical language to impress people who did not know any better. He was the kind who listened. He would put his ear close to a running engine and close his eyes and hear things that other people could not hear. Tiny variations in the rhythm that meant something was wrong before anything showed up on a diagnostic. He used to say that a machine will always tell you what it needs. You just have to be quiet enough to listen. Imani had tried to be that quiet her whole life. She rinsed her coffee cup and went back to work. At 8:45 in the morning, a truck she had never seen before pulled into the lot, and a man in a gray suit got out. He had the kind of face that was carefully designed to appear trustworthy, clean-shaven, slightly tan, with eyes that moved over things slowly and assessed them without appearing to. He did not come inside the garage. He walked up to the bay door and stopped and looked at the sign above it with the patient expression of someone making a mental note. He introduced himself as a representative of Crane Development Partners. He handed her an envelope. She took it without opening it and watched him drive away. Then she opened it. The letter inside was written on heavy paper with a letterhead that cost more than her electricity bill. It informed her in language that had been carefully assembled by lawyers who were paid to make things sound both formal and inevitable that Morrison's garage was in violation of the city of Rockfield's updated land use and zoning ordinances as revised in 2022, and that the property at 1140 Callaway Street had been flagged for non-compliance review. She was given 30 days to cease operations and vacate the premises or to appear before the zoning board to contest the findings. She read the letter twice. Then she set it on the workbench and looked at it for a while. She had been expecting something. She had not known what form it would take. But she had known for the past 8 months. that Aldous Crane was building something in Rockfield, and that the something he was building was spreading out from the northeast corner of the downtown district in the direction of Calloway Street, the way a stain spreads across fabric slow and certain, and already larger than you thought it was before you noticed it. She had watched the announcements in the local paper. She had watched the properties change hands one by one, each sale reported as a neighborhood improvement, a sign of growth and investment in Rockfield's future. She had watched the names disappear from the storefronts. The Vickers hardware store that had been on Route 12 for 30 years. Gone. The barbershop that old Cecil Pruitt had run since the Carter administration. Gone. The laundromat on 5th Street where half the town dropped off their clothes every Saturday morning. Gone. Each one replaced by a construction fence and a rendering of something shiny and modern that looked like it belonged in Dallas and not in Rockfield. And now, Crane was looking at Calloway Street. At her. She folded the letter and put it in her back pocket and went back to work on the Harley, because there was nothing else to do right now, and because the bike needed her attention, and because she had learned a long time ago that panic is only useful if it makes you move faster toward something, and she did not yet know what she was moving toward. Della came in at 9 o'clock as she always did, unlocking the small side door with the spare key Imani had given her 6 months ago, when the girl had proven herself reliable enough to trust with the key. Della Haynes was 17 years old and had been asking to apprentice at Morrison's garage since she was 15, when she had wandered in off the street with a bicycle chain that had come off its sprocket and had watched Imani fix it in 40 seconds, and had apparently decided in that moment that this was what she wanted to do with her life. Imani had not taken her on immediately. She had made the girl wait and prove she was serious and demonstrate that she was capable of showing up consistently, which Imani considered the most underrated mechanical skill in existence. But Della had proven herself. She was quiet and observant, and had the kind of attention to detail that most people do not develop until they have made a sufficient number of expensive mistakes. She came in now and looked at the partially disassembled Harley and did not say anything. She poured herself a cup of coffee and stood near the door and looked at the bike the way Imani had looked at it with real attention. "That is a 1965, she finally said. Imani said yes. Della asked what was wrong with it. Imani told her, briefly, with the kind of shorthand that only works between two people who already share a vocabulary. Della nodded slowly, taking it in, and then she went and got her coveralls from the hook by the side door and put them on and came back and looked at the bike with different eyes. Working eyes. They had a good morning. At 11:45, two things happened almost simultaneously, which was how things always seemed to happen when the world was beginning to move in a direction you could not stop. The first thing was that Mrs. Audrey Briggs, who had been bringing her Lincoln Continental to Morrison's garage for 7 years, called to cancel her December appointment. She did not give a reason. She was very polite about it. She said she was going to be trying somewhere else for a while, and she wished Imani well, and she was gone. The second thing was that Imani's phone rang again 20 minutes later, and it was Terrence Okafor from the feed store on Route 12, who said he had heard that Morrison's garage was closing. He was not asking about his truck anymore. He was calling to confirm that the rumor was true. Imani told him the rumor was not true. He sounded uncertain. She told him again. Then she hung up. She stood at the workbench with her hands still for a moment. Crane had not waited 30 days. He had not waited 30 hours. In a town the size of Rockfield, where information moves through the diner and the barbershop and the parking lot of the First Baptist Church faster than it moves through any wire or signal. A rumor was more efficient than a legal notice. A legal notice you could contest. A rumor you could not disprove fast enough. By the time she could get in front of people and say, no, it is not true. We are not closing, we are still here. The version of the story that had Crane's fingerprints on it would have moved through enough mouths to have become a kind of soft, plausible fact in the minds of people who had no particular reason to disbelieve it. She understood what this was. She had read about it later in the documents she found years after her father died in the files from the lawsuit that had taken everything from him. This was the same playbook. Different decade, different letterhead, same hands. She was still standing at the workbench when she heard the motorcycles. She had heard motorcycles before. Rockfield was on a route that a lot of riders used in the warmer months. And on spring weekends, the highway had a particular sound to it, a low, rolling percussion that came and went like weather. But this was different. This was not the highway. This was the lot. She walked to the bay door. 3 Harley-Davidsons had pulled in off Callaway Street and were idling in a loose triangle near the gas pumps. All 3 were serious machines, not show bikes, not the kind that got trailered to rallies and never got dirty. These were working bikes modified for distance and weight, with saddlebags and crash bars, and the particular kind of road wear that you cannot fake. The men on them were serious men. The one in the middle was the largest. He turned off his engine first and swung his leg over the seat in the deliberate way of someone whose knees have been complaining for a long time, but who has made his peace with the complaint. He was somewhere around 58 years old, maybe older, with a beard that had gone mostly gray and arms that were covered in tattoos from his wrists to where his jacket sleeves ended. He was wearing a leather vest over a flannel shirt, and on the back of the vest was the patch that told you everything you needed to know about who he was and who he rode with. The other 2 men dismounted and stood where they were. One of them was wide and methodical looking with a shaved head and the quiet, organized presence of someone who spent a lot of time thinking before acting. The other was leaner with a military bearing so ingrained it showed even in the way he stood still. Neither of them spoke. The big man in the middle walked toward the garage. He walked past the gas pumps and past the old bench where Imani sometimes ate her lunch, and past the faded parking lines that had been repainted twice since her father painted them the first time. And he stopped at the bay door and looked at the sign above it. He looked at it for a long time. Morrison's Garage, the letters her father had painted, the ones she had touched up herself. He looked at the sign with an expression she could not read. And then he looked at her and the expression shifted into something more guarded and more complicated than simple surprise. He said he was there to pick up his bike. He had a voice that sounded like gravel in a metal can, low and rough and without inflection, the voice of a man who chose his words the way other men chose tools for function. She asked him his name. He said Hank Mercer, but he said it in a way that suggested the name on its own was incomplete information, the way some people say their name and you can hear the rest of what they are. The weight they carry under the name behind the name. In Rockfield, she had heard the name Gravel Mercer, the way you hear about weather systems forming somewhere else, distant and theoretical but real. She knew who he was. She knew what he was. She brought him to the bay where the Harley sat. She had not finished the job. She had only had it 12 hours, and she had found the problems and begun the work. But she had not completed it. And she told him this in the same way she told every customer directly, and without softening it. The bike had seized because of 3 separate issues that had each been allowed to develop too long. She named them. She told him what the work would involve. She told him what it would cost and how long it would take. He listened without interrupting. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked her in a voice that had gone quieter than before if she was related to Joseph Morrison. The question landed in the air between them and stayed there. She said yes. She said Joseph Morrison was her father. She kept her voice level and her hands still at her sides, and she watched his face. Something moved across it. Not surprise exactly. Something older than surprise. He looked at the bike and he looked at the sign above the door, and he looked at his hands for a moment, and then he looked at her. He said that her father had fixed his bike in the summer of 1999. He had broken down on Route 12 about 7 miles north of Rockfield. He had been coming off a long run 3 days on the road, and the bike had started throwing codes about 40 miles out. And by the time he limped into Rockfield, the machine was running on stubbornness and little else. He had pushed it to the nearest garage because that was the only thing left to do. That garage had been Morrison's. Joseph Morrison had come out and looked at the bike without saying much, and then had gone to work on it. It had taken 3 hours and involved several parts he had to fabricate himself, because he did not have the right ones in stock. He had done the work cleanly and completely, and when Gravel had asked him how much he owed Joseph Morrison, had looked at him for a moment and said nothing. No charge. Keep the rubber side down. Gravel had tried to pay him. Joseph Morrison had shaken his head and gone back inside. Imani listened to this without speaking. She had heard stories about her father's work before. His former customers still talked about him in the present tense, sometimes the way you do with people who left a deep enough mark that the past tense still feels dishonest. But she had not heard this one. She said she had not known that. He said that her father was the kind of man you do not forget, and that when he saw the name on the sign, he had not expected to feel what he felt. But he felt it anyway. Then he told her he would pay her double her quoted rate for the Harley. And he said it the way a man says something when he is not negotiating, when the number is not the point. She started to say that was not necessary. He looked at her with the particular directness of someone who has made up his mind and who has very little patience for counter-arguments. She let it go. He told her the 2 men who had come with him were Gerald Bowen, who most people called Pitchfork, and Ray Stokes, who most people called Cutter. He said this as if it were a formality that needed completing before anything else could proceed. Pitchfork was standing near the workbench now, looking at the tools organized on the pegboard with the careful attention of someone who notices the quality of a system. Cutter was standing near the bay door, looking at nothing in particular, which Imani recognized as the stance of a man who is watching everything. Gravel told her to call him when the bike was ready. He put a number on a piece of paper and left it on the workbench. And then he and the other 2 men walked out. The 3 bikes started in sequence, a deep rolling sound that moved through the bay like something physical. And then they were gone, and the garage was quiet again. Della came around from behind the 1987 Ford, where she had apparently been working quietly through the entire exchange, and looked at Imani. She did not ask any questions. She went back to what she was doing. Imani went back to the Harley. She thought about her father sanding down his hands in 1999 doing 3 hours of work for a man he had never met and would probably never see again, and not taking a dollar for it. She thought about the way her father moved through the world, the quiet conviction of it, the refusal to do things halfway, even when halfway would have been enough. Even when no one was watching and no one would have known the difference. She had tried to be that. She was not sure she had managed it. The afternoon went by in work. At 3:45, a small figure appeared in the bay door. Pearl Whitfield was 9 years old and lived 3 houses down from the garage in the yellow house with the broken porch light that her mother had been meaning to fix for 2 months. She came to the garage most afternoons after school because her mother worked the late shift at the hospital, and the arrangement was that Pearl would stay with Imani until her mother got off at 6. Pearl sat on the old wooden stool in the corner and did her homework, and occasionally asked questions that she expected to be answered seriously. And Imani answered them seriously because Pearl was the kind of child who could tell when she was being managed. Today, Pearl came in with her backpack and her homework folder, and also a small yellow plastic camera. It was a children's disposable camera, the kind they sold at drugstores, and Pearl held it up as though it were evidence of something. She said she had been taking pictures. Imani asked of what. Pearl said of things she saw. She said she had almost used up the whole roll. She was going to ask her mother to get them developed. She said she had taken some pictures at school, and some pictures of the cat that lived under the Jimenez family's porch, and some pictures from the window of the school bus. She said she had also taken a picture of a big, ugly truck. Imani was wiping down a wrench. She said that was interesting. Pearl said it was parked at the end of her street for a long time. She said it was there 2 days in a row, and that seemed strange to her, and she did not like how it looked. And so she took a picture of it. Imani set down the wrench. She looked at Pearl. She asked what color the truck was. Pearl said, dark blue. She said it was very big and very dirty, and it had something on the back that she could not see clearly. She said the men inside did not get out. They just sat there. And when she walked past them on her way to school, they watched her. Imani looked at the camera in Pearl's hand. She said that Pearl should put the camera in her backpack and keep it safe, and that she would ask her mother about getting it developed. Pearl tucked the camera into the front pocket of her backpack with the careful attention of a child who has been told something is important and takes that seriously. Then Pearl sat on her stool and got out her homework folder and started working on her spelling words, and Imani went back to the Harley, and the afternoon moved in the direction of evening. At 5:15, Pearl looked up from her homework and said she was going to walk to Mrs. Gentry's house because she had forgotten her library book there, and she needed it for school tomorrow. She said Mrs. Gentry lived on the next block. She said she would be back in 10 minutes. Imani said to be careful. Pearl said, okay. She put on her backpack and walked out into the early dark of the February evening, and Imani watched her go and then turned back to the Harley. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Imani waited. At 5:45, she called Pearl's mother at the hospital. Pearl's mother said she had not heard from Pearl. Her voice changed quickly the way a mother's voice changes when something drops out of it that was there before. She said she would call Mrs. Gentry. Imani was already at the door. She walked to Mrs. Gentry's house, moving quickly in the cold. The front light was on. She knocked, and Mrs. Gentry opened the door. An older woman in a housecoat, and Imani asked if Pearl had come by. Mrs. Gentry said no. She said she had not seen Pearl today. Imani stood on the porch for a moment in the cold. She looked up the street and down the street, and the street was empty, the way streets in small towns are empty on cold February evenings. The houses lit from inside, the sidewalks dark. She went back to the garage and called Pearl's mother again. Then she called the Rockfield Police Department non-emergency line. She reported a missing child and gave Pearl's name and description and the time she had last been seen. And the woman on the other end of the line told her that an officer would be by. Imani went back outside. She walked the block between the garage and Mrs. Gentry's house 3 times. looking into yards, looking into the narrow gap between buildings, looking for anything. The cold was settling in hard now. The kind of February cold that comes at dusk and does not plan to leave. On her second pass, she stopped. She was standing near the mouth of the alley that ran behind the hardware store, which was the hardware store that used to be the Vickers Hardware, and was now a construction storage yard for the Crane Development Partners project on the northeast side of downtown. The alley was dark. There was nothing in it, except a small yellow plastic camera. It was lying on its side in the gravel near the fence of the construction yard. The front pocket of Pearl's backpack had a tendency to come open if you did not zip it carefully, and Pearl had not always been careful about zipping it. Imani picked up the camera. She stood in the alley for a long moment looking at the fence of the construction yard, looking at the camera in her hand. Pearl had been here. Whether Pearl had dropped the camera accidentally or deliberately, or whether it had fallen without anyone noticing, Pearl had been here in this alley, near this fence, and Pearl was not here now. Imani walked to the Rockfield Police Department, which was 4 blocks away, and which she reached in 7 minutes. She asked to see someone about the missing girl. She was told that an officer was being dispatched to her location. She said she was already here. She was brought to a room and she waited. And after 14 minutes, Sheriff Bud Dillard came in. He was a large man with a face that had been unremarkable at 40 and had continued to be unremarkable with age. The kind of face that does not give you much to read because there is nothing much written on it. He sat down across from her with the deliberate ease of someone who is not in a hurry and who wants you to know it. She told him about Pearl. She told him about the camera and the truck Pearl had described and the picture Pearl said she had taken. She told him about the alley and where she had found the camera. She placed the camera on the table between them. Dillard looked at the camera. He picked it up and turned it over in his hands, with the expression of someone handling an object they have already decided is unimportant. He said that kids wander off all the time. He said February was cold and Pearl had probably gone inside somewhere and forgotten to call. He said that in his experience, the great majority of missing child reports in a town the size of Rockfield resolved themselves within a few hours. Imani said she understood that. She said she also knew that Pearl was not the kind of child who forgot to call, and that Pearl had last been seen near a construction yard owned by Aldous Crane. She said the name deliberately. Dillard's expression did not change. That was what she noticed. When she said Crane's name, nothing moved in Dillard's face. Not recognition, not surprise, not the small involuntary adjustment of expression that happens when a name lands with unexpected weight. Nothing at all. The kind of nothing that is not neutral. The kind that is practiced. He said that the investigation would proceed appropriately. He said they would look into the camera. He put the camera in his jacket pocket. She asked if she could have it back. He said it was being taken in as potential evidence. She asked for a receipt. He wrote one out with the particular slow patience of a man who knows that the paper does not change anything. She left the police station. She stood on the sidewalk outside in the cold. The camera was gone. The photograph Pearl had taken, the dark blue truck, the partial plates, all of it was in Dillard's jacket pocket. She stood there for a moment with the receipt in her hand. Then she thought of something. She thought of Della, who had the particular habit of very young and observant people who have grown up around situations where information disappears. The habit of making her own copy of things. She called Della's cell phone. Della picked up on the second ring. Imani asked her if she had done something with her phone before they went to the police. Della was quiet for a moment. Then she said that when Imani had picked up the camera in the alley and been looking at the fence, Della had been standing behind her, and she had opened the camera's viewfinder window and used her phone to photograph the image showing in the preview. It was blurry. It might not be useful, but she had it. Imani closed her eyes. She stood on the cold sidewalk outside the Rockfield Police Department with the receipt in one hand and her phone in the other, and she breathed in and out twice. Then she thanked Della and told her to go home and not talk to anyone about this tonight. She told her to keep her phone close and her doors locked. She walked back to the garage. She went inside and she locked the door, and she went to the workbench and she sat down, and she did not turn on any additional lights. She sat in the partial dark with the flickering fluorescent above the third bay, throwing its unsteady light across the floor. She thought about Pearl walking out into the February evening with her backpack and her library book errand and her small yellow camera in the front pocket that she had not zipped closed. She thought about the dark blue truck parked at the end of Pearl Street 2 days in a row. She thought about the legal notice in her back pocket on heavy paper with expensive letterhead. 30 days zoning violations cease operations. She thought about her father in 1999 doing 3 hours of work for a stranger on Route 12 and not taking $1 for it. She thought about what her father would do. He would not panic. He would not go loud. He would not give anyone a reason to dismiss him or contain him or redirect him with paperwork. He would go back to the machine. He would listen to what it was telling him. He would find the problem, the real problem, beneath the problem, the thing underneath the thing, and then he would fix it. Imani sat in the dark garage. The Harley was in the second bay, partially disassembled its engine, exposed its parts laid out on the floor in the careful arrangement she had made for herself, so that nothing would be lost and everything would be findable when she was ready for it. She got up. She went back to the Harley. She picked up her light and her tools, and she went back to work, because the work was still there. And Pearl needed someone who was thinking clearly, and not someone who had given themselves over to fear. And the way Imani had always found her clearest thinking was through her hands. The fluorescent light above the third bay flickered. The wind moved along Callaway Street. Morrison's garage was still open. The night passed in the way that bad nights pass when you do not sleep. Not all at once, but in pieces, each hour giving way to the next, with the particular reluctance of time that is being endured rather than lived. Imani stayed at the workbench until nearly 2 a.m, and then lay down on the cot she kept in the back office for nights when she worked too late to make the drive home sensible. And she stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind move along Callaway Street, and did not sleep until sometime around 4. And even then it was not real sleep, but the shallow, restless kind that leaves you more tired than you were before. She was up again at 5:30. She made coffee on the old 2-burner in the office and stood at the small window that looked out onto the lot and watched the sky go from black to the particular dark blue that comes just before dawn. In February, when the cold is at its worst and the world looks like it is deciding whether to go on or not. Pearl had been missing for 12 hours. Imani had called Pearl's mother twice more before midnight. The second time, Pearl's mother had not said anything for a long moment, and then had asked Imani in a voice stripped of everything except the question itself, if she thought Pearl was safe. Imani had said yes because it was the only answer she could give, and mean it, or at least mean the intention behind it. the willingness to make it true through whatever she could do next. She sat down at the old metal desk in the office and opened her laptop. Morrison's Garage had been keeping digital service records since 2016, when Imani had finally replaced her father's handwritten ledger system with a database that a former customer had helped her set up. The database was not sophisticated by any commercial standard. It was essentially a large, searchable spreadsheet with entries going back 8 years organized by date and vehicle type and the name or business under which the vehicle was registered. Imani had entered every job herself, every oil change and brake job and transmission, rebuild and engine diagnostic every vehicle that had come through the bay doors of Morrison's Garage in the past 8 years. She typed in a search for dark blue trucks. There were 41 results. She narrowed it by vehicle class. 23. She went through them one by one, opening each entry and reading the registration information she had logged at intake. Most of them were pickups. A few were work vans. One was a box truck that belonged to a landscaping company that had since gone out of business. She was looking for something large enough to match Pearl's description. Something with a rear cargo area, something registered to a business rather than an individual, because the truck Pearl had described was not a personal vehicle. It was a work truck, dirty heavy, the kind that carries things. She found it at entry number 17. It was a 2018 Ford F350 Super Duty dark blue extended cab with a cargo bed cover. It had come in 14 months ago for a transmission service. The registration was under the name Caldwell Site Services LLC, with a business address on Route 9, approximately 6 miles outside Rockfield. She sat back in her chair. She thought about what Crane Development Partners did and how companies like that operated, which was not through their own name, when they needed something done quietly, but through a web of smaller entities with neutral names, site services and property management, and logistics and consulting. Each one a layer between the center and the surface, each one deniable individually and damning collectively. If you could see them all at once. She did not know yet if Caldwell Site Services LLC was part of that web. But she knew the truck. She had worked on its transmission herself. She remembered the job because the transmission had been in worse shape than the owner had admitted on the intake form, which was not unusual, and she had done the work right, even though it cost more than the estimate, which was also not unusual. She wrote down the registration information. She wrote down the address on Route 9. Then she called Della. It was not yet 6 in the morning. Della answered on the third ring with the alert voice of someone who had been awake for a while, which did not surprise Imani. She asked Della to send her the photograph she had taken of Pearl's camera the evening before. Della said she already had. Imani checked her messages and found it. The image was blurry in the way that photographs of photographs are blurry with a double layer of distortion from the angle and the lighting. But it was not useless. The truck in Pearl's photograph was dark blue and large with a cargo bed cover and a partial view of the front plate. The plate was not complete. 3 characters were visible: the number 4, the letter R, and what might have been a 7 or a 1. Not enough on its own, but enough combined with the registration she had found to place the same vehicle in 2 different locations at 2 different times with 2 different connections to the same name. She thought about what Dillard had done with the camera, the practiced blankness on his face when she had mentioned Crane. She thought about the speed with which the camera had disappeared into his jacket pocket, and about the receipt he had written out with that patient, deliberate slowness. The slowness of a man who is not worried about the receipt, because the receipt is not going to change anything. She thought about what she could do with what she had, and what she needed before she could do more. At 7:15, she opened the door and turned on the bay lights and stood in the middle of the garage for a moment looking at the space her father had built. The workbenches he had built from salvaged lumber in 1991. The pegboard on the far wall where tools hung in the outlines he had traced himself. So that everything had a place, and a missing tool was immediately visible as an absence. The old wooden stool in the corner where Pearl sat on weekday afternoons. She went to the Harley. She worked on it for 2 hours with the concentrated focus of someone using their hands to keep their head clear. And it worked the way it always worked. Because the problems in an engine are finite and solvable, and they yield to the right approach, given enough patience and skill. And there is a particular kind of comfort in that. Even when the problems in the world outside the engine are neither finite nor clearly solvable. At 9:30, Della came in. Imani showed her what she had found in the service records. Della looked at the screen with the focused attention she brought to everything, reading the entry twice, her lips moving slightly on the second pass. She said that the address on Route 9 was near the old Kellerman property. She said she knew that area because her older brother used to fish in the creek that ran behind it. She said there was a warehouse on that property, a big one that had been sitting empty for years. Imani asked how she knew about the warehouse. Della said that a few months ago, her brother had mentioned that the road to the creek was blocked off now. He said there was a new fence and a gate with a lock on it, and that you could see the warehouse from the road, and there were vehicles parked there that had not been there before. Imani sat with that information for a moment. Then she asked Della to stay at the garage and handle anything that came in, and she said she was going to make some calls. She spent the next 2 hours doing something that most people would not have thought to do, and that required a particular kind of patience and memory. She went through the service records again this time, looking not for the Ford truck specifically, but for any vehicle registered to any business with an address on Route 9 within a 5-mile radius. She found 4. 3 of them were farm equipment registered to a family named Beaumont, who had been farming that land for decades and were clearly unrelated to anything she was looking at. The 4th was a white panel van registered to something called Meridian Property Holdings, serviced 18 months ago for a brake job. She searched Meridian Property Holdings online. The company had a website that was clean and minimal, and said almost nothing in the way of websites that are designed to exist rather than to inform. It listed a registered agent in Austin and a mailing address that was a post office box. It described itself as a real estate investment and property management company. She searched Crane Development Partners. The website was more substantial. It had photographs of completed projects and a timeline of development history, and a page of community testimonials from civic leaders in 4 different Texas cities. Aldous Crane himself appeared on the About page in a photograph taken at what appeared to be a charity gala, wearing a tuxedo and smiling the particular smile of a man who has learned to make his smile do work. She searched both names together. The results were thin at first. A press release from 2 years ago announcing a development partnership in Waco. A mention in a municipal planning document from a city council meeting in Beaumont. Nothing that connected them directly in a way that meant anything. But on the 3rd page of results, she found something. A local news article from a small paper in Galveston, 18 months old, about a zoning dispute in a neighborhood that had been undergoing rapid development. The article mentioned several companies involved in the development project. One of them was Crane Development Partners. Another, mentioned in passing in the 4th paragraph as a subsidiary entity involved in site acquisition, was Meridian Property Holdings, the same company whose van she had serviced. The same company with an address on Route 9. She printed the article on the old inkjet printer that sat on the corner of the desk and added it to the notes she had been keeping since the previous evening. She put everything in a manila folder and labeled it with the date. Then she heard the vehicles, two of them pulling into the lot from Callaway Street. She looked out the office window and saw a Rockfield Police Department cruiser and a second vehicle unmarked dark. The kind of car that belongs to someone who wants the authority of a police vehicle without the visibility of one. She came out of the office. Dillard was not with them. The man who came through the bay door was younger than Dillard. A deputy, she recognized a man named Hester, who had brought his truck in for service twice, and who had a way of looking at her that had always struck her as the particular look of a man who has been told what to think about someone and has accepted the instruction without examining it. He told her she was being brought in for questioning in connection with an active investigation. He told her the garage was being temporarily sealed, pending an inventory of vehicle parts on the premises. He told her this in the flat, prepared voice of someone reciting something they have been given, rather than something they have arrived at themselves. She asked what the charge was. He said there had been a complaint filed that morning regarding the possession and sale of vehicle parts that had been reported stolen. He said it was a routine matter and that her cooperation would allow it to be resolved quickly. She stood very still. She looked at the deputy who did not meet her eyes directly, and she looked at the second man who was standing near the bay door with his hands in his jacket pockets and who had not introduced himself and who was not a Rockfield police officer. She could tell by the way he stood in the space, too comfortable in it, too indifferent to her presence in a way that suggested she was a detail in a situation he had already mapped completely. She thought about Pearl. She thought about the folder on the desk in the office. She told the deputy she needed to get her jacket from the office. He said that was fine, and he followed her to the door of the office but did not come in. And she took her jacket from the hook behind the door. And she also took the manila folder and folded it in half and tucked it into the inside pocket of the jacket in a single motion that she made as ordinary looking as possible. The way you learn to do things without drawing attention to them when you grow up in circumstances where attention is not always safe. She came out of the office and she went with the deputy. Della was standing near the workbench. Her face was controlled in the way of a young person who is frightened, but has decided not to show it. Imani looked at her as she passed and said, "One thing, call Gravel Mercer and give him the number from the workbench." That was all she said. Then she was outside in the cold February air, and the cruiser door was closing behind her. The Rockfield Police Department had 2 holding rooms. They were not cells in any technical sense. They were rooms with locked doors and fluorescent lighting and the particular institutional smell of a space where people sit and wait and are not given information. She sat in one of these rooms for a long time. An officer brought her a paper cup of water at some point and she drank it and set the cup on the floor beside her chair. She was not afraid. That was the thing she noticed about herself, and that she turned over in her mind while she sat there. She was not afraid in the way that she might have expected to be, the way that she had been afraid during the years of legal battles after her father died, when the fear had a quality of vertigo to it. The sense of something large and indifferent moving in a direction she could not alter. This was different. This was clarifying. She thought about the deputy who had arrested her, Hester. She had serviced his truck twice. She remembered the second service about 8 months ago. A straightforward job, new brake pads and rotors on a 2019 Chevy Colorado dark blue. And she remembered that at pickup, Hester had mentioned he had been doing some work on the weekends out near Route 9, some fencing and site prep for a new operation. He had mentioned it in the offhand way that people mention things when they are comfortable, when they are not thinking about what they are saying or to whom. She had not thought anything of it at the time. She thought about it now. Route 9, Site Prep. A man who worked for Dillard and who did weekend work for someone with a property on Route 9. She thought about the warehouse Della's brother had described, the fence, the gate, the vehicles that had not been there before. The folder was still in her jacket. She kept her jacket on. Gravel Mercer arrived at the Rockfield Police Department at 11:45 in the morning. She knew this because she heard him before she saw him, not loudly, but with a kind of low, settled gravity that moved through the building ahead of him. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply appeared at the desk and stated what he was there for, and the particular quality of his stillness apparently communicated enough that things moved faster than they might otherwise have moved. Pitchfork was with him. Gerald Bowen sat in a chair in the outer room and opened a small notebook and began writing in it. And the officer at the desk watched him with the particular discomfort of someone who has been looked at by someone who knows more than they do, and who is in the process of learning more. The charge that had been filed that morning fell apart faster than Imani had expected. The complaint was vague in its specifics, and the inventory of the garage, which had been conducted by Dillard's people in her absence, had apparently produced nothing that could be characterized as stolen parts by anyone willing to put their name on a document that would later be examined. Within 2 hours of Gravel's arrival, she was standing in the front room of the police department with her jacket and her folder and her cold cup of water. She looked at Gravel. He looked at her. He said that outside there were currently 22 motorcycles parked along Callaway Street, and that 17 more were on their way from the chapter in Beaumont, and that if she gave him a name and an address, things could be resolved by this evening. She understood what he was offering. She understood the weight of it, what it meant for a man like Gravel to put that kind of resource into motion, on her behalf, the debt it represented, and the trust it required on his part, and the history it was rooted in. She said no. He was quiet for a moment. She said it as plainly as she knew how to say it. She said that there was a 9-year-old girl somewhere in this county and that the people responsible for her disappearance had been operating in this town for 2 decades at least, and had their fingerprints on everything from the zoning board to the sheriff's department, to possibly the county court. And that, if what happened next was 300 motorcycles and broken windows, and men with badges making arrests on thin pretexts and everything that followed from that, then Aldous Crane would be sitting in a lawyer's office by Monday morning and walking out of a courthouse by Tuesday. And he would keep walking until he was somewhere she could never reach him. She said she needed something else. She said she needed what was true to be provable. Not just known, provable. Gravel was quiet for a moment longer this time. Then he asked what she needed from him. She said she needed Pitchfork. They went to the garage. Della had stayed. The garage was technically still sealed, but the seal was a notice on the bay door that had no legal force remaining given that the underlying charge had not produced a formal arrest. Imani went inside and sat down with Pitchfork at the workbench and spread out the contents of the folder between them. Gerald Bowen was not what he looked like. That was what Imani had gathered from the way Gravel spoke about him briefly and without elaboration, but with the particular economy of words that signals respect. He had been a federal financial crimes investigator for 22 years, before he retired and patched in with the Rockfield chapter. He had the organized mind of someone who has spent decades looking at the architecture of deception the way fraud is built layer by layer, each layer designed to make the next one invisible. He went through the folder without speaking. He read the service records. He read the article from the Galveston paper. He looked at the photograph of the dark blue truck from Pearl's camera. He wrote things in his small notebook. He asked Imani 3 questions, each one precise, each one building on the last, and she answered them as completely as she could. Then he sat back and looked at the wall for a while. He said that what she had found was suggestive but not sufficient. He said that the connection between Crane Development Partners and Caldwell Site Services and Meridian Property Holdings could be mapped given time and access to the right records, but that mapping it from the outside without subpoena power would take weeks at minimum. He said that what would change the speed of things was physical evidence, documents, the kind that could not be explained away by a good lawyer arguing coincidence. Imani said she knew where to look. He told her not to do anything illegal. She said she was going to look through a window. Route 9 ran northeast out of Rockfield through flat, dry ranch country that had the particular emptiness of land that has been worked hard and left to recover. In February, the scrub along the roadside was gray and low, and the sky above it was the color of old concrete. Imani drove her truck out there in the early afternoon alone because she had told Gravel she was going to look first, and she meant it. And because she knew that arriving at this location with 20 men on motorcycles would accomplish nothing except to announce her presence to people who would then have time to move things and move Pearl. She found the gate at mile marker 11. It was new heavy steel mounted on posts that had been sunk recently because the concrete around the bases had not fully weathered yet. Beyond the gate, a gravel road ran about 200 yards to a large metal warehouse building, the kind used for agricultural storage, gray-sided with a green metal roof. There were 2 vehicles visible in front of the warehouse. One was a dark blue Ford truck. She parked on the shoulder 100 yards past the gate and got out and walked back along the fence line in the pale afternoon light, moving slowly and without urgency in the way of someone who is simply walking, which is the only sensible way to move in a situation where being noticed would be a serious problem. The fence was chain link 6 feet with no barbed wire at the top, which suggested it was designed to discourage rather than prevent. She walked its length until she was at a point where a stand of cedar trees on the property side gave enough cover that the warehouse could not be seen from the road, and she could not easily be seen from the warehouse. She did not go over the fence. She stood at the fence and looked. The warehouse was large enough that its interior layout was not immediately apparent from the outside. There were 2 loading bay doors on the near side, both closed. There was a single personnel door to the left of the bays. There were 3 windows, small and high, on the wall, the kind of windows in a building that are there for light, rather than visibility. She stood at the fence for a long time. Then she heard something. It was faint and it was brief, and it might have been wind moving through the structure, or it might have been an animal, and it might have been something else. It lasted only a few seconds. It had a quality that she could not fully articulate, but that she felt in the place in her chest where she kept things that mattered. She walked back to her truck. She sat in the truck for a while with her hands on the steering wheel. She went back that night. She did not tell Gravel she was going. She did not tell Della. She drove out to Route 9 at 11:15 when the road was empty, and the county was as dark as it gets on a February night, with overcast sky and no moon to speak of. She parked 2 miles from the gate and walked back on the shoulder of the road with a small flashlight that she kept off except when she needed it moving on the gravel beside the asphalt to reduce the sound of her steps. She reached the fence at the cedar trees. She went over it. It took her about 45 seconds. She had climbed chain-link fences before, and she knew how to do it quietly. She crossed the open ground between the fence and the warehouse in the shadow of the building, keeping low and moving steadily. The two vehicles were still in front. No lights were visible from the interior through the high windows. She could not tell if anyone was inside the building, or only outside it, or neither. She reached the personnel door. She pressed her ear against it. And there it was again. The sound she had heard in the afternoon, clearer now, close. A child. Not crying, not screaming, just the sound of a child in a space that was not meant for children. The small, involuntary sounds of someone who has been frightened for a long time and has run out of the energy to express it. Pearl was alive. Imani stood at that door with her hand flat against the metal of it, and her eyes closed for 3 seconds, long enough to say something. She did not say out loud. Something that was not quite prayer and not quite promise, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. She did not open the door. She went to the near side of the building and found what she was looking for. A narrow gap between the bottom of the wall cladding and the foundation, about 2 inches wide enough at one corner where the metal had been improperly fastened. She could not get through it. She could get her phone through it sideways at an angle. She took 11 photographs of the interior through the gap. Most of them were black, the phone camera struggling with the near total darkness. 2 were partially lit by a strip of light coming from somewhere deep in the interior. In those 2, she could make out the shapes of shelving units and what appeared to be stacked cardboard boxes, and in one corner a sleeping bag on a piece of plywood, and the small curled shape of a child on top of it. She pulled her phone back through the gap. She went to the window on the far side of the building, the one that was partially blocked by a ventilation unit mounted on the exterior wall. The ventilation unit created a narrow ledge. She got up on it and looked through the window. The light she had seen through the gap came from a work lamp on an extension cord somewhere in the rear of the building. By that light, she could see the boxes she had photographed from below. They were banker's boxes of the type used for document storage, the kind with the removable lids and the labels on the ends. Most of them had labels. She could not read the labels at this distance and in this light, but there were many of them, arranged on shelving that ran the length of the near wall floor to ceiling, the kind of shelving you use when you need to store a large volume of paper and access it with some regularity. She took 6 photographs through the window. Then she got down from the ledge and crossed the open ground to the fence and went back over it and walked 2 miles along Route 9 to her truck. She sat in the truck and looked at the photographs on her phone. In the 2 that were lit well enough to be useful, she could read 4 of the box labels clearly. Each label had a project name and a date range. 2 of the project names she did not recognize. One she recognized as a neighborhood in Waco that had been mentioned in the press release she had found online. The 4th project name was one she had been living with for 23 years, Rockfield Corridor, 2001 to present. She photographed the screen with a second phone. The old one she kept in the truck as a backup, so that the images existed in 2 places. Then she drove back to Rockfield. She reached the garage at 2 in the morning. She called Pitchfork and told him what she had found and what she had seen. And she described the boxes and the labels and what she knew about the Rockfield Corridor project from her own history with it and from the documents she had found after her father died. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he told her that what she had described, combined with the financial trail he had spent the afternoon mapping from the property records and business registration databases that were publicly accessible, was enough to make a serious case. He said the kind of case that goes to a federal field office rather than a county courthouse. She asked him how long it would take to put the filing together. He said he needed the morning. He said by noon the next day he would have a package that he could take to the FBI field office in Dallas in person on paper, with documentation and witnesses, and that what she had provided from inside the warehouse would be corroborating evidence of a standard that a federal agent would not be able to dismiss. She said Pearl could not wait until noon tomorrow. He understood. He said the filing would go in at 8 in the morning when the field office opened. He said that federal agents move faster when a child is involved and when the documentation is clean. He said she had to trust the process now. She said she trusted him. She hung up and sat at the workbench in the dark garage. At 2:47, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Della's number. One sentence. She is alive. Room at the back. I found the side door open. Imani looked at the message. She called back immediately. The phone rang 8 times and went to voicemail. She called again and again. Nothing. She sat very still at the workbench with her phone in both hands, and she looked at the message, and she understood what had happened. Della had done what Della always did, which was to observe and act and not wait for permission. And she had driven out to Route 9 on her own in the middle of the night, because she was 17 years old and Pearl was 9, and Della did not weigh the calculus of risk the way a person with more years on them might weigh it. She had found the side door. She had gone in, and now she was not answering. Imani stood up. She stood up so fast, the stool scraped back hard against the concrete floor, and the sound of it went through the garage like something breaking. She called Gravel. He answered on the first ring, which meant he had not been sleeping either. She told him. She told him everything. She told him about the warehouse and the boxes and Pearl and the filing and pitchfork. And she told him about Della's message and about the phone that now rang and produced nothing but silence. When she stopped talking, there was a pause of about 4 seconds. Then he said, "Where?" She said, "Route 9 mile marker 11. She was already moving toward the truck when she heard him say one more thing in that gravel and metal voice of his, low and quiet, and without any inflection at all. He said, "Bring the folder." She drove fast, not recklessly, but with the kind of speed that comes from a decision already made. The kind that does not second-guess itself at intersections or recalculate at stop signs. The roads out of Rockfield at 3 in the morning were empty in every direction, and the headlights of her truck cut through the February dark like something trying to get ahead of itself. And Imani drove with both hands on the wheel, and her eyes on the road, and her mind on the distance between where she was and where Pearl and Della were. And she did not let herself think about anything else. She heard them before she saw them. She was still half a mile from mile marker 11 when the sound reached her through the closed windows of the truck, low and layered and unmistakable, the sound of many engines running at idle. The particular resonance of it that you feel in your chest before you fully register it in your ears. She had heard motorcycle engines her whole life, singly and in small groups. But she had never heard this many all at once, all running with that same patient, deliberate rhythm like something breathing. She came around the long curve in Route 9 and saw them. They were lined up along both shoulders of the road, for as far as the headlights reached motorcycles. Too deep in some places, their engines running and their lights on, and the riders sitting on them or standing beside them without moving, without speaking, without doing anything except being there in the numbers that they were there in. She would count later or try to, and she would lose track somewhere past 250. In the moment, she only saw them as a fact, a physical fact of the night, the way weather is a fact, the way the darkness is a fact. something that was simply present and that changed the character of everything around it. The gate at the warehouse road was still closed. There were 3 Rockfield Police Department vehicles parked at angles on the road near the gate with their lights going, and she could see Dillard standing between 2 of them with his hat pushed back and his arms at his sides, and his face doing the particular calculation of a man who has spent 20 years being the largest force in a room and who has just discovered what it feels like to be very small. She parked behind the last line of motorcycles and got out. Gravel found her almost immediately. He was moving through the gathered riders with a contained purposefulness, speaking to men who nodded and relayed and repositioned without any visible urgency. The whole thing operating with an organization that had the quality of something that had been practiced not for this specific situation, but for the general situation of which this was an instance. Men who knew how to move in numbers and how to hold a position, and how to make their presence mean something without making it mean violence. He came to where she was standing and he looked at her without expression, and she looked at him. She asked about Della. He said one of his men had gone over the fence on the south side 40 minutes ago. A man named Stokes Cutter who had medical training and who knew how to move without being heard. And that what Cutter had found was that the personnel door on the near side of the warehouse was open, and that there was a light on inside that had not been on when the first riders arrived, and that he had heard 2 voices inside, one of them adult female, and one of them a child. Imani said Della and Pearl. Gravel said that was what it appeared to be. He said Cutter had gotten close enough to confirm that both were unharmed, that Della appeared to have entered the building and found Pearl, and that the 2 of them were together in the rear of the building and had not yet been discovered by whoever else might be on the property. Imani breathed out slowly. She asked where the men from the warehouse were. He said there had been 2 of them. He said that when the motorcycles began arriving on Route 9, approximately 90 minutes ago, the 2 men who had been inside the building had come to the gate, apparently to see what was happening on the road, and had found 240 motorcycles. He said the men had gone back inside and had not come out again, and that their vehicle, the blue Ford truck, was still parked in front of the warehouse. She asked about the police. He said Dillard had arrived 40 minutes ago with 3 vehicles and had told him Gravel to disperse. He said he had explained to Dillard that they were not blocking the roadway and were exercising their legal right to be present on a public road, and that they would continue to do so. He said Dillard had made 2 phone calls after that and had then gone very quiet, which in Gravel's experience was never a sign that things were going well for the person who went quiet. She asked about Pitchfork. Gravel said that Gerald Bowen had left Rockfield at 6:30 that evening 8 hours ago, driving his personal vehicle to Dallas with a physical file that contained 47 pages of documentation, including financial records, property registration trails, the Galveston News article, and 3 others that Pitchfork had subsequently located the photograph of the blue truck from Pearl's camera. Imani's service record for the same vehicle, the business registration connecting Caldwell Site Services to Meridian Property, holdings to a third entity that Pitchfork had identified in the afternoon as the financial instrument through which Crane Development Partners move money. Between projects, the screenshots of the box labels from Imani's photographs, and a 6-page summary that Pitchfork had written himself in the precise, structured language of a man who spent 2 decades writing documents that federal prosecutors would find useful. She asked if Pitchfork had reached the field office. Gravel said yes. He said that Pitchfork had called him at 12:40 in the morning, which was about 2 hours ago, and had said that the material had been received by a special agent who had enough experience with financial crimes to understand what she was looking at. and enough seniority to make a decision about it without waiting for a committee, and that the agent had made several calls, and that a response was being coordinated. Imani looked at the gate. She looked at Dillard standing between his vehicles, with his arms at his sides and his face doing its calculation. She looked at the long rows of motorcycles and the men on and beside them, still impatient in the February dark, with their engines running and their lights on, and she thought about what this was, what it looked like from the outside, what it communicated. It was not a threat. A threat moves towards something. This was something else. This was a presence that said, "We know, and we are here, and we are not leaving." And it said it without a word, in the language of numbers and commitment, and the willingness to be cold on a February night in the service of something that mattered. She walked to the gate. Dillard watched her come. She stopped at the gate and looked through it toward the warehouse, and then she looked at Dillard. She said there was a 9-year-old girl and a 17-year-old girl inside that building, and that they needed to come out now, and that if Dillard wanted to make himself useful, for the first time in his career in this county, he could open the gate. Dillard looked at her for a long moment. He looked past her at the motorcycles. He looked back at her. He said that the property was private and that he did not have authority to compel entry without a warrant, and that she should step back from the gate. She said his authority in this county was going to be the subject of a federal investigation by morning, and that he should think carefully about whether the instructions he was following tonight were worth what they were going to cost him in the very near future. Something moved in his face then. The practiced blankness cracked not dramatically, not in the way of a man who has lost all composure, but in the way of a thin layer of ice when the temperature shifts a barely visible fracture that meant the whole surface had changed. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and she let him look because she had nothing to hide in what he could see in her face. She heard it before she saw it. A different engine sound, not motorcycles. The low, powerful sound of large vehicles moving at speed on Route 9 from the direction of the highway, and then headlights. Multiple sets coming around the long curve from the east. And then they were visible, and they were black SUVs, 4 of them moving in the organized formation of federal vehicles, and behind them, a white van that she recognized as a forensic unit vehicle from the time she had seen them on television. They stopped at the perimeter of the motorcycle line, and the riders parted for them without being asked, opening a lane down the center of the road, the way water parts around something moving through it, and the SUVs came through and stopped at the gate. The agent who got out first was a woman in her late 40s with the efficient posture of someone who has spent a long time walking into situations that other people were walking away from. She had a badge visible on her belt and a jacket that identified her affiliation, and she did not look at the motorcycles or at Dillard with anything except the focused attention of someone who has a job to do and knows how to do it. She and Dillard exchanged words that Imani was not close enough to hear. Dillard's portion of the exchange was brief. The agent's portion was longer and came with the kind of documentation that Dillard received with both hands, and then stood holding with an expression that had gone entirely blank in a way that was different from the practiced blankness. This was the blankness of a man who has run out of things to perform. The gate opened. The federal vehicles moved down the gravel road to the warehouse. Imani watched them go. She watched the lights of the warehouse come on, all of them flooding the building from inside so that the high windows glowed. And she watched the personnel door open and 2 agents go in. And she watched the 2 men from the warehouse come out of the front loading bay door 4 minutes later with their hands in front of them and federal agents behind them. And then Della came out. She came out of the personnel door with a federal agent walking beside her, and Pearl in her arms. The child's legs wrapped around Della's waist, and her face pressed into Della's shoulder. And Della was walking carefully and deliberately, the way you walk when you are carrying something precious, and you have been frightened, and you are not going to let the fear show, because the thing you are carrying needs you to be steady. Imani went through the gate. She did not run. She walked fast, crossing the gravel with her eyes on Della and Pearl. And when she reached them, she put both hands on Pearl's back, and Pearl turned her face from Della's shoulder and looked at Imani. And for a moment, neither of them said anything. Pearl's face was pale, and her eyes were swollen from crying that had happened some time ago, and had stopped some time ago, leaving only the evidence of it. She was wearing the same clothes she had worn when she walked out of the garage the evening before, and she still had her backpack, which she had apparently refused to take off even inside the warehouse, because Pearl Whitfield was the kind of child who held onto her things. She said Imani's name. Imani said she was here. She said Pearl was safe now. She said it was over. Pearl pressed her face back into Della's shoulder, and Imani kept her hands on the child's back, and the three of them stood in the cold gravel of the warehouse lot, while the federal vehicles and the agents and the evidence and the remains of Aldous Crane's operation arranged themselves around them in the procedural aftermath of something that was ending. Cutter was there. He had come out of the shadows of the south fence line when the agents arrived, and he had his medical kit with him, and he checked Pearl and Della both with the practical thoroughness of someone who has done this kind of work before, in worse conditions. He said Pearl was cold and dehydrated and frightened, but physically unharmed. He said Della had a bruised forearm from where she had caught herself on the fence going over it, but was otherwise fine. Della said she was completely fine. Cutter said she had a bruised forearm. Della said she had bruised her arm before and had kept working. Imani looked at her for a moment and thought about a girl who would drive herself out to Route 9 in the middle of the night on 17 years of stubbornness and love for a 9-year-old who sat on a stool in the corner and did her homework. And she felt something in her chest that did not have a clean name, but that was not entirely different from what she felt when she stood in the garage and looked at her father's tools hanging in their outlines on the pegboard. She told Della she had done something extremely dangerous and inadvisable. Della said she knew. Imani said she was glad she had done it. Della looked at her. She said she knew that too. Pearl's mother arrived 20 minutes later. She had been called by an agent from the field office. She came down the gravel road on foot, having left her car on Route 9 because the gate area was dense with vehicles, and she had apparently not waited to find a way through, but had simply gotten out and walked. And when she reached Pearl, she gathered the child from Della's arms and held her in a way that made everything that had happened in the previous 30 hours compress into a single image of what it had all been about. Imani stood back. She gave them the space that the moment required. She walked to where gravel was standing at the edge of the vehicle area, watching the federal operation with the particular patience of a man who has seen the aftermath of many things and understands that aftermath has its own requirements and its own timeline. She stood beside him. He said nothing for a while. She said nothing either. Then she said that she thought Pearl was going to be okay. He said that children were tougher than people gave them credit for, and that he had seen it enough times to believe it was not just something people said. She asked if he was speaking from experience. He looked at the warehouse for a moment. He said that he had grown up in a situation that was not simple and that had required him to be tougher than was fair. and that he had survived it, and that the surviving was the thing that mattered in the end. She thought about that. She thought about her father who had survived things that were not fair, and who had built something from what he had, and who had done his work cleanly and completely, and without asking for anything in return, except the right to keep doing it. The sun came up while the federal agents were still working. It came up the way February suns come up in Texas, without ceremony, the sky going gray, and then pale orange along the eastern edge, and then the light spreading flat and cold across the scrubland, and the road and the warehouse and the long rows of motorcycles that had not moved. The riders had been there all night. Some of them had gotten off their bikes and walked to keep warm. Some had talked to each other in the low, steady way of men who are comfortable with long silences and who do not fill time with noise for the sake of it. Some had brought coffee in thermos bottles and passed them along the line. At some point, someone had produced food of some kind, and it had moved through the assembled group with the same unhurried generosity. None of them left. When the federal agents led Aldous Crane out of his house at 6:40 in the morning, it was not at the warehouse. It was 12 miles away at the large house on the north end of Rockfield that he had built in 2009, with the particular taste of a man who wants his wealth visible from a distance. Stone facade and a circular drive and landscape lighting that was still on in the February dawn. He came out in the suit he had apparently been sleeping in, or perhaps had put on when he heard the knock. Because a man like Crane does not answer federal agents in his pajamas if he can avoid it, even when there is nothing left that the suit can do for him. 2 agents had gone to Bud Dillard's house at the same time. Dillard came out in his pajamas. The handcuffs on both men were a federal matter documented and photographed by agents who had been doing this long enough to know that documentation done correctly at the beginning saves a great deal of difficulty later. They were placed in separate vehicles and driven in separate directions, and the Rockfield County Sheriff's Department lost its sheriff before most of the town had finished its first cup of coffee. She heard about it from a call from the agent who had led the operation, a brief professional call that gave her the facts without editorializing, and told her that she would need to provide a formal statement, and that a time would be arranged for that, and that her cooperation and the materials she had provided through Gerald Bone had been essential to the speed with which the operation had been able to proceed. She said she understood. She drove back to Rockfield. She drove back to Callaway Street, and she parked in the lot of Morrison's garage, and she got out of the truck, and she stood in the February morning looking at the building her father had built from money he had saved for 6 years on a long-haul route from El Paso to Memphis and back. The seal from the previous day's bogus search was still on the bay door. It was a notice on paper taped over the frame. She removed it carefully without tearing it, and folded it and put it in her jacket pocket beside the folder. And then she unlocked the bay door and rolled it up, and the smell of the garage came out to meet her motor oil and cold metal, and the particular silence of a space that has been waiting. She turned on the lights. The Harley was in the second bay where she had left it. Partially assembled, the work interrupted by everything that had happened since she started it. She walked to it and stood beside it and looked at it for a while, at the parts laid out in the careful arrangement she had made for herself, each one in its place, each one findable when she was ready. She was ready. She put on her coveralls and she went to work. The days that followed had the quality of a tide going out, slowly revealing what had been underneath the whole time. The federal investigation moved with a thoroughness that reflected the depth of the file Pitchfork had delivered. And as it moved, it uncovered things that even Imani had not known were there. The connection between Crane Development Partners and its subsidiary entities ran not just through Rockfield and Waco and Beaumont, but through 7 Texas counties over a period of 19 years. A network of site acquisition and zoning manipulation and fraudulent documentation that had moved money and displaced people and consumed properties in amounts that required a dedicated forensic accounting team to fully catalog. The Rockfield Corridor Project, which bore the name she had been living with since she was 13 years old, was not the beginning of that network, but it was the place where the method had been refined the first time. Crane had combined legal pressure with coordinated rumors with the corruption of a local official, and what worked in Rockfield had been applied elsewhere with adjustments the way you apply what you learn from one engine to the next. Pitchfork spent 3 weeks in Dallas working with the federal team. He drove back and forth twice and stayed in a motel near the field office for 5 days in the middle of that period. And when he came back to Rockfield, he was quieter than usual in a way that Imani recognized as the quietness of a man who has seen the full size of something and is still calculating what it means. He told her that the documents in the warehouse, the banker's boxes on the shelving, contained the original paperwork for many of the transactions in the network. Not copies, originals. He said it was the kind of thing that happened when someone is confident enough in their control of the local environment that they stop being careful about where they store things, because they believe the environment itself provides the protection they need, and that no one outside their control will ever be able to reach inside it. He said that the boxes from the Rockfield Corridor section contained the original documents from the 2001 proceedings against Joseph Morrison's garage. She asked what those documents showed. He told her. The zoning complaint that had initiated the action against her father in 2001 had been filed by a party that was not disclosed in the public record. The public record showed the city of Rockfield as the originating authority. The original documents showed that the complaint had been generated by an entity connected to Aldous Crane, then a younger and less prominent developer, who had been quietly accumulating land in the Callaway Street corridor for 2 years before he made his move against Morrison's garage. The judge who had ruled against her father's appeal, the same judge who had signed the document, approving Imani's arrest 33 years later, had received payments from a Crane-connected entity in the 6 months preceding the ruling. The payments were structured as consulting fees for real estate advisory services. The judge had no real estate experience. She sat with that information. She had known her father's business was taken from him through a process that was wrong. She had known it in the way that children know things through the evidence of consequences, rather than the architecture of cause through watching her father's face change in the months after the ruling through the wait in the house, and the silences at the table and the way her father worked harder and harder at a thing that was already broken beyond what work could fix. Until one morning in March 2003, when he did not come down for breakfast, and she went up to find him. And he was lying on his side with one arm stretched toward the edge of the bed, as if he had reached for something in the night and not been able to get there. She had known it was wrong. She had not known until now exactly how it was done, and by whose hand, and what it cost, and what it purchased. She sat at the workbench in Morrison's garage on a cold Tuesday afternoon, with Pitchfork sitting across from her, and she was very still for a long time. Then she thanked him. He said there was nothing to thank him for. He said he had done his job. She said that it was more than that, and she said it looking at him directly, and he received it in the way that men like him receive things like that, without deflecting and without expanding on it. Just a brief nod that acknowledged the weight of what was being said, and then a return to the matter at hand. The matter at hand was the hearing that had been scheduled by the county court for the following month, at which the fraudulent zoning documentation that had been used in the original 2001 proceedings and in the 2024 notice she had received from Crane's representative would be formally invalidated. She would need to appear. She would need documents. Pitchfork had already assembled most of what was required. She said she would be there. He said he knew. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in early March, when the weather had turned enough that you could stand outside without feeling like the cold was a decision it had made specifically about you. Imani finished the Harley. She had worked on it in the evenings after the regular shop hours, making it the last job of the day. The way you save the best thing for when you have the focus to give it. She had replaced what needed replacing and rebuilt what could be rebuilt and cleaned and adjusted and tuned until the machine had become what it was supposed to have been, which was not merely functional, but precise, each system integrated with each other system, in the way of a thing that has been properly understood by the person working on it. She rolled it out of the second bay into the morning light. She started it. The sound of it in the parking lot of Morrison's garage on Callaway Street in Rockfield, Texas, was the sound of something coming back from wherever things go when they stop working, a full, resonant, completely composed sound that had no hesitation in it, no roughness, no unevenness. It ran the way an engine runs when every part of it has been properly attended to, which is to say it ran the way things run when someone who genuinely understands them has taken the time to listen. She called the number Gravel had left on the workbench. He arrived an hour later. He came alone, which was unusual, and she noticed it. He parked his own bike and walked to where the Harley sat in the morning light, and he stood before it without speaking for a long moment. He walked around it once. He crouched beside the engine and looked at it from that angle, and she watched him look at it with the eyes of someone who has had a relationship with a machine long enough to see when it has been properly cared for. The way you can tell when someone has looked after a thing, rather than simply serviced it. He stood up. He said that the last person who had worked on this bike the way she had worked on it was the man she learned from. And he said it plainly as a statement of fact. And she heard what was in it beneath the plainness of it. She said, "Thank you." He said she should not thank him for telling the truth. She got out her invoice and handed it to him. He looked at it and reached into his jacket and produced an envelope and held it out to her. She took it. It was too thick to be payment for the Harley alone, and she looked at him. He said there were 2 things inside. He said the first was payment for the bike at twice the invoice rate as they had discussed. She said she had told him that was not necessary. He said he had heard her say that and had made his own decision. She let it go the way she had let it go the first time because she understood that this was not negotiation. He said the second thing was something else. He said she should open it when she was ready, and that there was no urgency about when that was. He said he had been carrying it for longer than he was comfortable admitting and that it was time for it to be where it belonged. She put the envelope in the pocket of her coveralls. She walked him to the bike, and they stood there for a moment in the March morning with the sound of Callaway Street around them. The ordinary sounds of a small Texas town. In the middle of a Saturday, a dog somewhere, a screen door, someone's radio playing something the country, and old through an open window. He put his hand on the handlebar of the Harley. He looked at it one more time. He said her father had given him something that could not be paid back in any direct sense, and that he had understood that from the beginning, and had tried to act accordingly in whatever way the years made available. He said the years had made available a particular thing recently, and he hoped it was enough. She said she was sure it was. He swung his leg over the Harley and settled into the seat with the ease of someone returning to something that belongs to them. The weight of himself adjusted and settled in the way of a long familiarity. He started the engine. The sound of it moved through the morning and she felt it in her chest. He looked at her once more and she looked at him, and then he rode out of the lot onto Callaway Street, and she watched the Harley go, the sound of it following him down the block and around the corner until it became part of the general sound of a Saturday. And then it was gone. She went back inside. She sat at the workbench. She took the envelope from her pocket. Inside were two things, as he had said. The first was the payment bills in the amount that he had told her, and that she had already stopped arguing with. She set it aside. The second thing was folded soft with age, the paper having been unfolded and refolded enough times that the creases had gone from crisp to gentle. She unfolded it carefully. It was a receipt from Morrison's garage. It was dated August 14th, 1999. The vehicle was a 1993 Harley-Davidson FXDS convertible. Service performed was listed in her father's handwriting as engine diagnostic and repair oil and filter carburetor adjustment chain and cable inspection, and what her father had written as miscellaneous road wear assessment and correction. Under the line for total amount due in the same handwriting in ink that had faded from black to a soft brown in the 25 years since it was written, her father had put a 0. And beside the 0, he had written in his small and steady hand, "No charge." Keep the rubber side down, friend. She looked at it for a long time. On the back of the receipt in different ink and handwriting that she did not recognize, but that she understood immediately to be Gravel's someone, had written a single line. The handwriting was not smooth. It was the handwriting of a man who does not write often, but who, when he does, means exactly what he puts down. It said, "Paid in full, 25 years late," and below that, HM. And below that, clipped to the receipt with a paper clip that was new and bright against the aged paper, was a document. It was a certificate of property ownership. It was dated originally from 1989, when her father had first purchased the land and building at 1140 Callaway Street, Rockfield, Texas. It bore the county recorder's seal and her father's signature, and the name Joseph Emmett Morrison in the typed line above the signature. Someone had had it notarized again recently with a new seal and a new date that was 3 weeks old, affirming the continuity of title through the legal proceedings and their subsequent invalidation, making the document current and complete, and unambiguous in what it said about who the land and building at 1140 Callaway Street belonged to. She sat at the workbench in Morrison's garage with the receipt and the certificate in her hands, and the fluorescent light above the third bay flickering the way it always flickered on cold days, and the smell of motor oil and metal around her, and the tools hanging in their outlines on the pegboard where her father had put them. She was very still. She did not cry, not exactly or not only. What happened was quieter than crying and larger than it, the way some things that have been held for a long time finally release, not with noise, but with weight. The weight of 21 years of a fight that had required her to be harder than was fair, and the sudden understanding that the fight was over. Not because she had given up, not because she had been defeated, but because she had done what her father could not finish, and it had held. She sat there until the stillness had completed itself. Then she got up. She washed her hands at the shop sink, the way she always washed them thorough and practiced the water running dark with oil before it ran clear. She dried her hands on a clean shop rag and hung it back on its hook. She put the receipt and the certificate back in the envelope, and she put the envelope in the drawer of the workbench, the center drawer, the one with the lock where she kept the things that mattered most. She got out the intake form for the next job, a 2008 Ford F-150, with a transmission that had been slipping at highway speed. The customer had been waiting since the previous week when things had prevented her from getting to it. She clipped the form to the board above the second bay where the intake forms always went, and she rolled back the bay door. And the March morning came in with its pale light and its smell of distance. Della arrived at 9 o'clock as she always did, with her coveralls over her shoulder and her coffee in her hand and her attention already on what was waiting to be done. She looked at the bay and she looked at the intake form and she looked at Imani. She asked if they were opening. Imani said yes. She said there was a transmission job waiting and she wanted Della to start the diagnostic while she finished the paperwork from yesterday. Della put on her coveralls. She went to the Ford and stood beside it and looked at it the way Imani had taught her to look at a vehicle, not at the surface, but into it, at what the surface was telling her about what was happening underneath. At 10:15, Pearl came through the gap in the fence between her yard and the back of the garage lot. The gap she had made months ago by bending back 2 wires of the chain link, which Imani had noticed and had chosen not to repair. She was wearing her backpack and she had a library book under her arm, and she came into the garage the way she always came in, without knocking, because she had been coming in without knocking for long enough that the knocking would have been strange. She climbed onto the old wooden stool in the corner. She opened the library book. After a little while, she looked up and watched Imani work the way she always watched, with the real attention of a child who was interested in the thing itself and not just in being somewhere. She watched Imani's hands on the engine, and she watched the way the tools moved, and she watched the care in it, the patience of it, the way each action built on the one before it in the direction of something that worked. Imani felt her watching. She did not look up. She worked. The transmission revealed its problems slowly, the way transmissions do, giving up one thing at a time. And Imani listened to what each thing told her and responded to it and moved to the next. And the morning went by, and the sound of tools and the smell of the garage and the light coming through the bay door onto the floor where it always came. And Morrison's garage was open on Callaway Street in Rockfield, Texas. And the sign above the door said what it had always said in the letters her father painted, and that she had touched up herself, matching the color as closely as she could. She was not going to change the way her father had written his name.